Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out here, where the mountains scrape the sky and the wind whispers secrets through the pines, justice isn't found in a courtroom. It's forged in fire, paid for in blood, and served cold as a Montana winter. This is a story of a woman who was left for dead, and the man who would tear the world apart to see her vengeance done. A story of when the wilderness itself screams for retribution. The first snow of the season was a liar. It fell in soft, apologetic flakes, a delicate veil over the jagged teeth of the northern Montana Rockies. It promised peace, a quiet slumber for the world beneath. But Elias Cutter knew better. He'd lived in these mountains for 15 years, long enough to learn that the prettiest snows often hid the deepest graves. He was tracking a bull elk, a magnificent beast with a rack like a thorny crown, when he found her. The elk's trail, usually a clear, decisive path through the lodgepole pines, had veered sharply, the tracks showing signs of panic. Elias, a man who moved with the economy of a predator, had paused, his weathered hand resting on the stock of his Hawken rifle. Animals didn't spook like this without reason. The reason was seldom good. He followed the disturbance, his keen eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanning the pristine white. A splash of crimson against a drift of snow was the first sign. Then another. He abandoned the hunt, his focus narrowing to this new, unnerving trail. It was a drag mark, not a footprint. Something, or someone, had been pulled through the snow, bleeding. He found her at the base of a granite bluff, a place the wind had scoured clean, leaving a patch of frozen earth exposed. She was a ruin of a woman, a tattered effigy of humanity left as an offering to the carrion birds. Her clothes were shredded remnants, her body a canvas of cruelty. Rope burns scored her wrists and ankles, wry and angry. Her face was a swollen mask of bruises, one eye sealed shut. But it was the brand that made Elias's stomach clench, a searing symbol of a crow's talon burned into the delicate skin of her shoulder. Crow's fang. The name was a foul taste in his mouth, a plague that had descended upon these mountains, preying on the weak and the unwary. He thought she was dead, another ghost to haunt these unforgiving peaks. He had seen death in every conceivable form during his years as a mercenary, a life he had clawed his way out of, seeking solitude as a penance. He knelt, not out of pity, but out of a grim, mechanical respect for the departed. He would give her a proper burial, a kindness the world had clearly denied her. As he reached out to close her one open eye, a flicker of movement beneath the bruised eyelid stopped him. A breath, so shallow it barely frosted the frigid air, escaped her cracked lips. Life. Stubborn, defiant, and utterly miraculous, life still clung to this broken vessel. For the first time in a decade, Elias Cutter made a decision that wasn't about his own survival. He was 45 years old, a man built of rawhide and regret, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. His hair was streaked with gray, his beard thick and untamed. He had come to this mountain to be alone, to let the silence scour the blood from his memory. But the silence had just been broken. He gently, methodically, checked her injuries. Broken ribs, he suspected, from the shallow, pained way she breathed. The brand was fresh, still weeping. Lacerations, deep and numerous. She was succumbing to exposure as much as her wounds. He worked quickly, stripping off his own heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapping her in it. Lifting her was like lifting a bundle of broken sticks. She weighed next to nothing, and a soft, agonizing moan escaped her as he settled her into his arms. The journey back to his cabin was an exercise in controlled urgency. He knew these woods better than the lines on his own hand, every game trail, every shortcut, every treacherous patch of ice. He moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his body a shield against the biting wind, the unconscious woman a fragile burden against his chest. Her faint breaths were a constant reminder of the flickering candle he was trying to protect from the gale. His cabin was built into the side of a hill, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was small, sturdy, made of hand-hewn logs he had felled himself, chinked with mud and moss. Inside, it was Spartan but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cot on the other. Shelves held dried herbs, smoked meats, and a few worn books. It was a hermit's sanctuary, a fortress against the world he had fled. Now, that world had been carried across his threshold. He laid her on his cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. The fire was banked, and he brought it back to roaring life with practiced ease. He filled the kettle with melted snow and set it to boil. As the warmth began to fill the small space, he turned his attention back to the woman. Cleaning her wounds was a grim task. He was gentle, his large, calloused hands moving with a surgeon's surprising delicacy. He had stitched more men on battlefields than he could count. But this was different. This wasn't the clean violence of a bullet or a blade. This was methodical, personal cruelty. Each cut, each burn told a story of prolonged agony, of a mind that took pleasure in and others' suffering. He washed the blood and grime from her face, revealing features that had once been beautiful. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, a cascade of dark, matted hair. She couldn't be much older than 22, a city girl by the look of the tattered remains of her dress. What was she doing out here? Traveling with a merchant train, most likely. The Crow's Fan were known for hitting supply wagons on the northern routes. They took the goods, killed the men, and as for the women, Elias had heard the whispers, the dark tales told in hushed tones in the trading posts he visited twice a year. He hadn't wanted to believe them. Now, the proof was lying on his bed. Her name was Clara Bell. He wouldn't learn that for 3 days. For 3 days, she drifted in a fevered haze, lost in a sea of pain and memory. Elias tended to her with a relentless patience he didn't know he possessed. He forced broth between her lips, cleaned and dressed her wounds with poultices of yarrow and comfrey, and kept the fire roaring, a constant bulwark against the encroaching cold that sought to claim her. During the long, silent nights, he sat in his handcrafted chair by the fire, oiling his rifle, sharpening his knives, and listening. He listened to her ragged breathing, to the words she muttered in her delirium. Fragments of horror. A man's laughter, deep and cruel. The name Black Vein, the snap of a whip. Pleading. Then silence. In those moments, something old and dormant stirred within him. It was the ghost of the man he used to be, Elias Cutter, the mercenary, the man who had once been paid to unleash hell. He had buried that man under years of solitude and self-imposed penance. He had sworn an oath to himself, on the unmarked grave of the last man he had killed for coin, that his hands would never again be instruments of death. But as he listened to Clara's tormented whispers, he felt the foundations of that oath begin to crack. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He was changing the dressing on her shoulder when her eyes opened. Not the delirious and focused eyes of the past few days, but clear, intelligent, and filled with a terror so profound it struck him like a physical blow. She flinched, trying to scramble away, a choked gasp of pain escaping her as her broken ribs protested. "Easy," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You're safe here." She stared at him, her one good eye wide with fear. He was a terrifying sight, a giant of a man with a wild beard and eyes that had seen too much. He looked like the very wilderness that had almost consumed her. He backed away slowly, raising his hands to show they were empty. "I found you in the snow. You've been here for days. My name is Elias." Her gaze darted around the small cabin, taking in the drying pelts on the wall, the rifles on the rack, the stark simplicity of it all. It wasn't a cage, but it was a trap. Her breathing quickened, her mind still caught in the nightmare. The others," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Elias's expression didn't change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Just you. I found only you." The relief that washed over her was immediately replaced by a wave of grief so powerful it buckled her. She began to sob, not loud, wailing cries, but silent, racking tremors that shook her entire body. Elias stood awkwardly, a mountain of a man completely out of his depth in the face of such sorrow. He did the only thing he could think of. He ladled a cup of warm broth and held it out to her. "Drink this," he said. "You need your strength." She eventually took it, her hands shaking so badly he had to steady them. She drank, the warm liquid a small comfort in a world of cold pain. For hours, she didn't speak again, just watched him with a wary, haunted gaze. He went about his chores, skinning a rabbit for their meal, splitting firewood, moving with a quiet competence that was strangely calming. He didn't press her, didn't ask questions. He gave her space, a commodity he valued above all others, and in doing so, he gave her the one thing she needed most, a sense of control. Later that evening, as the blizzard raged outside, cocooning the small cabin in a world of white, she finally spoke. "My name is Clara Bell," she said, her voice stronger now. Elias nodded, turning from the fire. "Clara, We were with a merchant train, heading for the Gallatin Valley. My father, he was a merchant. She paused, swallowing hard. They came at dawn. So many of them. They were animals. Elias just listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He let her talk, knowing the words were a poison that needed to be drawn out. She told him everything. She spoke of the raid, the screams, the gunfire. She spoke of being dragged from the wagon, of the leering faces and the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies. She spoke of the leader, a man with a dead eye and a cruel smile, the one they called Black Vein. And then she told him of the camp, of the torture. Her voice never rose, never broke. It was a flat, chilling monotone, a recitation of horrors that had been burned into her soul. She spoke of the pain, the humiliation, the laughter, especially the laughter. They had laughed as they hurt her, as if her suffering was the grandest joke in the world. They had a game, she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. They'd see how long someone could go without screaming. When it was my turn, I didn't give them the satisfaction. I bit through my own tongue, but I didn't scream. Elias looked at the fire, but he wasn't seeing the flames. He was seeing red. The cracking foundations of his oath crumbled into dust. The promise he had made to himself was a hollow thing in the face of this. It was a vow made by a man who had forgotten what true evil looked like. Clara had just reminded him. When they were done with me, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, they dragged me out into the snow. Black Vein, he knelt down. He told me to tell God that the crow's fangs sent me. Then he laughed and left me there. Silence descended on the cabin, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the howling wind. Clara had finished her story. The poison was out. Now, it hung in the air between them. Elias rose from his chair. He walked to the rack on the wall and took down a long, heavy-bladed knife, a vicious-looking weapon he hadn't used in years. He pulled a whetstone from his pack and sat back down. He began to sharpen the blade. The rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on stone filled the small cabin. It was a cold, deliberate sound. A sound of purpose. Clara watched him, her fear of him completely gone, replaced by something else. A flicker of hope. She had survived. That was the first miracle. But survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. Lying in the snow, waiting for death, a single thought had crystallized in her mind, a diamond of pure, unadulterated rage. Vengeance. They will pay for what they did, she said, and it was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. A declaration of war. Elias didn't look up from his work. The firelight glinted off the increasingly sharp edge of the blade. The silence stretched, and for a moment, Clara feared he would say no, that he would tell her to forget it, to heal and move on, that he was a man of peace now. Then he stopped. He tested the edge of the blade with his thumb. Satisfied, he looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the hermit, past the quiet mountain man. She saw the soldier, the mercenary, the killer he had been. His eyes were no longer the color of a winter sky. They were the color of a storm, cold and hard and utterly merciless. Pay, he said, his voice a low, gravelly promise. No, they're not going to pay. He stood up and placed the knife back on the rack, alongside a well-oiled Colt Patterson and a sawed-off shotgun. They're going to suffer, he said. Every single one of them. For every cut, for every burn, for every laugh. I'm going to take everything from them. Slowly. We're not just going to kill them, Clara. He turned to face her fully, his massive frame silhouetted against the fire. We are going to dismantle them. We'll use their own fear, their own cruelty against them. We will be the ghosts in the trees, the whispers in the dark. We will turn their hunting ground into their graveyard. They laughed while they tortured you. He gave a grim, humorless smile. Let's see if they'll laugh without teeth. In that moment, an unholy pact was forged in the heart of the frozen wilderness. A bond between a broken woman with an iron will and a man who had sworn off violence, only to find a reason to embrace it once more. Justice wasn't coming to the Crow's Fang gang. Elias Cutter was. And he was bringing hell with him. The blizzard that had cocooned them for days finally broke, leaving a world sculpted in brilliant, blinding white. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. For Clara, it was the first time she had been outside the cabin since Elias found her. Leaning against the doorframe, Wrapped in a deerskin tunic and leggings that were far too large for her, she watched the man who had saved her life. He was teaching her to shoot. Healing had been a slow, arduous process. Her body was a roadmap of their cruelty, and some nights, sleep offered no refuge, only a return to the firelight and the laughter. But with each passing day, a sliver of strength returned. The city girl, the merchant's daughter who had known only fabrics and figures, was being stripped away, layer by layer. In her place, something harder was taking root. Elias saw it in the way her gaze lost its vacant terror and sharpened into a focused, flinty resolve. He had started her with the Hawken rifle, the same one he'd carried when he found her. It was long, heavy, and its kick was brutal. "It's a part of you," he'd said, his voice patient but firm as he adjusted her stance. "Don't fight it. Breathe with it. Feel the balance. It's not just a tool for killing. It's a tool for living out here. It puts food on the table and keeps predators at bay. Today, we're just learning to make it listen." Her first few shots were wild, the recoil sending a jarring shock through her still-mending ribs. She flinched, her shoulder aching. Frustration welled up in her, a hot, useless emotion. "I can't," she gasped, lowering the heavy barrel. Elias walked over, his expression unchanging. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered instruction. "You're thinking about the cake. You're anticipating the pain. Forget it. There's only you, the rifle, and the target. Nothing else exists. Look at that pinnacone on the stump. See it. Don't just look at it. See every ridge, every shadow. When you see nothing else, you pull the trigger. Not before." She took a deep breath, the icy air stinging her lungs. She raised the rifle again. This time, she listened. She focused on the pinnacone, a small, insignificant object 100 yards away. The world narrowed. The weight of the rifle, thick in her shoulder, the memory of pain, it all faded into a dull background hum. There was only the target. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the kick still a brute. But this time, the pinnacone shattered into a dozen pieces. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It was a start. Their days fell into a grueling rhythm. In the mornings, Elias would put her through physical training. He taught her to track, to read the stories left in the snow. He showed her how to move silently through the forest, to use the terrain for cover, to become a part of the landscape. He was a demanding teacher, pushing her to her limits, then pushing her further. He was not just training a survivor, he was forging a weapon. In the afternoons, they focused on combat. The rifle, the pistol, the knife. She learned to load, fire, and clear a jam in the freezing cold until her fingers were numb and her movements were second nature. She learned where to cut, where to strike, the quickest ways to disable, the surest ways to kill. "There's no honor in a fight for your life," he told her as they practiced with knives, their breaths misting in the air. "Only survival. Strike from the shadows. Use their own momentum against them. A man expects a fight face to face. He doesn't expect a blade in the kidney while he's taking a piss." The words were brutal, a stark contrast to the life she had known. But she absorbed them, every harsh lesson, every cold piece of advice. The horror of her ordeal had burned away any romantic notions she might have had about the world. Elias was showing her the world as it was, not as it should be. Their evenings were spent in the cabin, the fire crackling between them. This was when the second part of their plan took shape. While Elias had been teaching her the physical act of revenge, Clara had been honing its direction. Her memory was the map to their vengeance. "There were at least 20 of them," she said one night, her voice low and steady as she sketched a rough layout of the Outlaws' camp in the ash on the hearth. But there was an inner circle, the ones who enjoyed it. She began to name them, to give faces to the monsters that haunted her. There was a big man, Jebediah. He had a red beard and a missing ear. He was the one with the whip. Her hand tightened into a fist. A skinny one, they called him Red. He had a nervous twitch, always looking over his shoulder. "He held me down. And him. Blackvein." She uttered the name like a curse. "He wasn't the biggest, but the others, they feared him. He has a dead left eye, white and clouded over. And he never raises his voice. He just whispers, and men jump." Elias listened, committing every detail to memory. He was the strategist, the tactician. He knew the land, the ways of men like these. He began to see the shape of their war. A gang that big needs supplies, he mused, staring into the flames. They need a place to sell their stolen goods, to get whiskey and women. They can't stay hidden in the mountains forever. They'll have a connection to a town, a corrupt official, a greedy merchant. His internal conflict, the battle against his old oath, had long since ended. It wasn't a surrender. It was a reevaluation. He had sworn not to kill for money, for politics, for another man's cause. This was different. This wasn't a job. This was a cleansing. The silence of the mountain he had sought was a selfish peace, a turning of his back on a world that still contained men like Black Vein. Clara's arrival had shattered that illusion. Justice didn't happen on its own. It had to be made. His hands, which he had tried to keep clean, were the only tools fit for the task. The sin, he reasoned, would not be in the killing, but in letting such men continue to draw breath. "We won't go after the whole camp at once," he said, his voice a low growl. "That's a fool's errand. We'll bleed them. One by one. We'll make them afraid of the dark. We'll turn them against each other. We'll use the traps they set for others and spring them on their own necks." He began to explain his philosophy of warfare, a brutal education forged in the blood-soaked battlefields of his past. He spoke of psychological torment, of turning a man's mind into its own prison. "We start with the outliers," he explained, pointing a thick finger at the edge of Clara's ash map. "Sentries. Scouts. The ones who feel safe because they're on the fringe. We make them disappear. Silently. No bodies, at first. Just gone. The others will notice. They'll get jumpy. They'll start seeing shadows in the trees. Their fear will be our greatest ally." Clara listened, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She was not just a victim seeking retribution. She was becoming a strategist in her own right. "Red," she said, her voice sharp. "The twitchy one. He's a coward. If the others start disappearing, he'll be the first to break." Elias nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "Exactly. We find the weakest link, and we pull until the whole chain snaps." The final piece of their preparation was the creation of their arsenal. Elias's cabin was not just a home, it was a workshop. He was a master of improvisation, a man who could see a weapon in a piece of scrap metal, a trap in a fallen log. Together, they fashioned wicked tools of their trade. They made deadfalls, massive logs suspended by ropes, ready to crush anyone who tripped the wire. They dug pit traps, lining the bottoms with sharpened stakes. Elias showed her how to make garrots from stripped leather, and how to mix a fine powder of dried herbs that, when thrown into a fire, would create a cloud of thick, choking smoke. But their masterpiece was born from Elias's past. He unearthed a heavy, locked chest from beneath his floorboards. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the remnants of his mercenary days. Among them were several small, black, iron spheres. "What are those?" Clara asked, her eyes wide. "Something I learned from a strange little man in a war far from here," Elias said, holding one up. "He called them thunder pots. You light the fuse, you throw it, and it makes a hell of a noise and a cloud of blinding white smoke. No good for killing, but perfect for creating chaos. Men who can't see, can't fight. They just panic." As the weeks turned into a month, the snow began to recede from the lower elevations. The world was awakening, and so were they. Clara's body had healed, leaving behind scars that she now saw not as marks of shame, but as reminders of her purpose. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable. She could strip and clean a rifle blindfolded. She could follow a trail for miles. She could kill. Elias watched her, a strange mix of pride and sorrow in his heart. He had wanted to save the young woman he found in the snow, but in the process of forging her into a warrior, he knew he was also killing the girl she might have been. They were two broken people, mending each other with the shared cement of vengeance. One evening, as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias deemed them ready. "They have a small outpost," he said, pointing to a spot on a worn map he had drawn. "A lookout point on the southern pass. They keep 2 men there, changing them out every week. It's far enough from their main camp that no one will hear them scream. We start there." Clara looked at the map, then at Elias. Her face was calm, her eyes cold as a mountain lake. The fear was gone, replaced by an icy resolve that chilled even him. "Which one do we take first?" she asked. Elias picked up the heavy-bladed knife he had been sharpening the day she told him her story. He handed it to her. "Hilt first." "You choose," he said. She took the knife, her grip firm and steady. The time for healing was over. The time for hunting had begun. The southern pass was a narrow artery cut through the granite heart of the mountains. It was a natural choke point, and the Crow's Fang gang used it well. On a high bluff overlooking the trail, they had built a crude lookout post, little more than a lean-to and a fire pit, but it afforded a commanding view of anyone approaching from the south. This was to be their first target, their first kill. Elias and Clara moved through the pre-dawn gloom like specters. They had traveled through the night, using the darkness as a cloak. Elias had insisted on it. "We own the night," he'd said. "They are men of firelight and loud boasts. The dark is their enemy. We will make it our home." Clara, dressed in dark buckskins Elias had fashioned for her, felt a strange sense of belonging in this silent, monochrome world. The fear she had once felt in the wilderness had been replaced by a quiet confidence. Elias had taught her its language, and now the snap of a twig, the call of a distant owl, the very scent of the air told her a story. They stopped a quarter-mile from the lookout, concealed in a thicket of firs. Elias pulled a long spyglass from his pack, an old brass instrument he kept meticulously polished. He scanned the bluff for long, silent minutes. "Two of them," just as the trapper said, he whispered, his voice barely a rustle of leaves. "One is sleeping, rolled in his blanket by the fire. The other is on watch. He's lazy, staring into the flames, not the pass." Clara's heart began to beat a little faster, a cold, steady rhythm. This was it. The abstract planning in the warmth of the cabin had now solidified into a terrifying reality. These were not targets on a stump. They were men. Men who had been there, who had laughed. Elias seemed to sense her thoughts. He put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "Remember what they are. They are not men. They are a disease. We are the cure. Clear your mind. Focus on the task. Hesitation is a luxury that gets you killed." She nodded, taking a deep, silent breath. He was right. She closed her eyes for a second, and in the darkness, she saw their faces, twisted in cruel mirth. The image was a whetstone for her resolve. When she opened her eyes again, they were clear and cold. "What's the plan?" she asked. "The one on watch is ours, but we need to separate them. The terrain is our weapon here." He pointed towards the bluff. The rock face was steep, almost a sheer drop, but to the west, it sloped down into a scree field of loose rock and scrub brush. At the base of that slope, there's a dense patch of aspens. You are going to create a diversion. Not a loud one. Something small. Something that a curious, bored man might go and investigate alone. He handed her a small, smooth stone. "When I give the signal, the call of a gray jay, Price, I'll throw this into the scree field, as far as you can. It will sound like a small animal, or a falling rock. Enough to get his attention. He'll come down to look. He'll leave his partner sleeping. When he enters the aspens, I'll be waiting." "And me?" Clara asked. "You will circle around to the east. The approach is harder, more exposed, but you are smaller, quieter. Once the first man is down, I will give the call again, this time once. That is your signal. The second man will still be sleeping. You will go into that camp, and you will finish it." He looked her directly in the eyes. "Can you do this?" It wasn't a challenge, but a genuine question. He was giving her the choice, the final opportunity to step back. But there was no stepping back. Not for her. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. He simply nodded, the matter settled. "Good. Go now. Don't move into position until you hear my signal." Clara melted into the woods, her movements fluid and silent, a testament to his relentless training. Elias watched her go, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he disappeared, moving west towards the aspen grove at the base of the bluff. Clara's journey was a tense, nerve-wracking crawl. She moved from tree to rock, her senses on fire. Every rustle of a pine bough, every gust of wind seemed amplified in the charged silence. She reached her position, a rocky outcrop that gave her a clear view of the scree field and the lookout post above. She could see the single sentry now, a hulking shape hunched over the fire. She waited, the small stone cool and heavy in her hand. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then it came. The clear, sharp call of a gray jay. Then, a moment later, again. The signal. With a steady hand, Clara threw the stone in a high arc. It landed deep in the scree field with a clatter of sliding rock. It was the perfect sound, loud enough to be heard, but natural enough not to cause alarm. Up on the bluff, the sentries had snapped up. He peered into the darkness, listening. After a moment of hesitation, he grumbled something, kicked at the fire, and grabbed his rifle. Just as Elias had predicted, his curiosity and boredom got the better of him. He started down the western slope, picking his way carefully towards the sound, leaving his partner slumbering by the fire. Clara watched him descend, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw him reach the bottom of the slope and enter the dark maw of the aspen grove. And then nothing. The silence that followed was more profound, more terrifying than the sound of the rock had been. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Clara waited, her muscles coiled, her eyes fixed on the camp. A single, piercing call of a gray jay cut through the night. My turn. Clara began her ascent. She moved with a speed and stealth she didn't know she possessed. Her focus was absolute. The sleeping form by the fire was her entire world. She crested the bluff, a shadow among shadows, the knife Elias had given her clutched tight in her hand. The man was a large, greasy lump, snoring softly, oblivious. A half-empty bottle of whiskey lay beside him. For a fleeting second, a wave of nausea washed over her. This was real. The finality of it, the intimacy of it. She pushed it down, fueled by the memory of laughter. She remembered Jebediah, the man with the red beard and the whip. This wasn't him, but he was one of them. He was guilty. She moved over him, her shadow falling across his face. She did exactly as Elias had taught her. One hand clamped over his mouth, stifling his waking shout, the other driving the knife home, just under the ribcage, angled up. It was a swift, brutal, and silent motion. The man's eyes flew open, wide with shock and pain. There was a brief, convulsive shudder, a gurgling sound, and then he went limp. His life ended not with a bang, but with a bewildered stare into the cold and blinking eyes of the woman he and his friends had left for dead. Clara pulled her hand away, her body trembling not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline and something else, a dark, chilling satisfaction. She had taken a life. She had taken back a piece of her own. She stood there for a moment, the dead man at her feet, the world silent save for the crackling fire. Then, a large shadow detached itself from the trees. It was Elias. He walked into the firelight, his own knife dripping. He looked at the body, then at Clara. His face was unreadable. "You did well," he said, his voice a low gravel. It was the highest praise she could imagine. He didn't let them linger. "We strip the camp, take their ammunition, any food, their rifles. We hide the bodies where no one will find them. We leave nothing. When the relief party comes, they will find an empty post. They will think these two deserted. It's the first seed of doubt." They worked with a grim efficiency, dragging the bodies into a deep crevasse and covering them with rocks. They scattered the ashes of the fire, making the camp look as if it had been abandoned for weeks. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern peaks, they slipped back into the forest, leaving behind only silence and questions. The journey back to the cabin was quiet. The adrenaline had faded, leaving Clara feeling hollowed out, exhausted. She had crossed a line, a Rubicon of the soul, and she could never go back. That night, back in the safety of the cabin, the weight of what she had done settled upon her. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The image of the man's dying eyes burned into her mind. Elias, sensing her turmoil, sat across from her. He didn't speak for a long time. "The first one is the hardest," he finally said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It should be. If it's ever easy, that's when you know you've lost a part of yourself that you can't get back." "Did you lose that part?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stared into the fire, and for a moment, she saw the immense weight of the years, of the things he had done, settle on his broad shoulders. "I did. For a long time. I was a blunt instrument, paid to kill for men who sat in comfortable chairs far from the blood. I became what they paid me to be. That's why I came here, to try and find some piece of that man I was before." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "What we are doing here, this is different. This is not for coin. This is for justice. Don't ever forget that. But don't ever let it become easy, either. Hold on to that feeling, Clara. It's what makes you better than them." His words were a strange comfort. He wasn't just her teacher, he was her confessor, the only other person in the world who could understand the darkness they were wading into. In the days that followed their first strike, a change settled over both of them. A silent understanding. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a unit, a two-person army. The shared act of violence had forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. They began to plan their next move. With their lookout posts gone, their southern approach is blind, Elias reasoned, sketching in the dirt floor of the cabin. They'll be sending out patrols to scout the area, to see why their men haven't reported back. The patrols will be in pairs. This is our chance to take two more. But this time, we do it differently. His eyes took on a glint of cold cunning. This time, we leave one of them alive. Just for a little while. He outlined his plan. They would set a trap on one of the main game trails. A simple snare that would hoist a man into the air by his foot, leaving him helpless. They would take his partner quickly and silently. Then, they would deal with the man in the trap. We need information, Elias said. We need to know the layout of their main camp, their routines, Blackveins' habits. A man dangling upside down, with a knife to his throat, tends to be very talkative. And after he talks, Clara asked, her voice steady. Elias's expression was grim. No witnesses. No survivors. The story he tells will be one we write for him. He explained the final, brutal piece of his plan. After they had the information they needed, they would kill the man. But they would leave his body in the snare, and they would do to him what the gang had done to Clara. They would brand him with the sign of the crow's fang. Let them find him, Elias growled. Let them see their own mark used against them. Let them wonder who is hunting them. Let the fear start to fester. They will think it's a rival gang, or someone they betrayed. They will start to look at each other with suspicion. They will start to tear themselves apart from the inside. And we will be the whispers in the pines, watching them do it. It was a cruel, merciless plan. It was psychological warfare at its most primal. It was perfect. Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but it was not a chill of fear. It was the icy thrill of impending retribution. She was no longer just a student of violence. She was becoming an architect of it. The girl who had been broken in the snow was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to return the favor, tenfold. The air in the valley was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. A low-hanging mist clung to the forest floor, muffling sound and turning the familiar landscape into a place of ghosts and shadows. It was the perfect weather for an ambush. For 2 days, Elias and Clara had watched the game trail from a ridge above. It was a well-worn path, a shortcut between the gang's main camp in the high peaks and the valley floor where they grazed their stolen horses. Elias, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain, had known this was the route a patrol would take. On the second afternoon, his patience was rewarded. 2 riders emerged from the mist below, moving at a relaxed pace. They were laughing, sharing a flask of whiskey. One was a hulking brute with a greasy, braided beard. The other was smaller, weary, with the nervous, darting eyes of a scavenger. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him instantly. "Rat," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. "The one on the right. That's him." Elias looked at her. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the stock of her rifle. Her face was a pale, tight mask of fury. "Good," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "He's the one we need. The coward. He'll talk. The big one dies first." Their trap was set 100 yards down the trail. It was a masterpiece of deadly simplicity. Elias had found a young, supple fir tree and, using a block and tackle he'd fashioned from rope and carved wood, had bent it nearly double. He'd attached a heavy rope with a slip noose to the top, anchoring the whole thing with a delicate trigger mechanism hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves and dirt on the trail. When stepped on, the trigger would release the tension, and the tree would snap upright, hauling its victim into the air. "It's all about placement," Elias had explained as they built it. "You don't put a trap in the middle of a trail. You put it to the side, right where a man would step to avoid a puddle or a rock. You use the landscape to guide his feet." Now, they watched as the 2 outlaws approached the spot. The big man was in the lead, his horse picking its way carefully. Rat followed a few paces behind. "Get ready," Elias breathed. "When the trap springs, I'll take the big one. Your job is to cover Rat. Don't kill him. But if he so much as twitches towards his gun, you put a bullet in his hand." Understood. Clara gave a curt nod, her eyes glued to the scene below. She sighted down the barrel of her Hawken, the cold metal a familiar comfort against her cheek. She centered the iron sights on Rat's pistol hand. The world narrowed to that single, small target. The lead outlaw of Jebediah guided his horse around a muddy patch on the trail. He stepped right onto the trigger. The result was instantaneous and violent. The trigger mechanism snapped, the bent for tree straightened with a sound like a giant whip crack, and the rope went taut. Jebediah was yanked off his feet with such force that his boots left the ground. The noose, intended for a man on foot, caught his horse square around the neck. The animal let out a terrified, strangled scream as it was lifted, kicking and thrashing, into the air. The trap designed for a 200-pound man was now holding a 1,000-pound horse. The fir tree groaned, its fibers screaming in protest. But it held. It was chaos. Wright yelled in shock, fumbling for his pistol. Jebediah, thrown clear, scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at his horse strangling to death 10 feet off the ground. Boom! The sound of Elias's rifle echoed through the valley, and naturally loud in the mist. Jebediah's head snapped back, a red flower blooming on his forehead. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, dead before he hit the ground. At the same instant, Rat finally cleared his gun from its holster. Before he could raise it, Clara squeezed her trigger. The Hawken bucked against her shoulder, and a gout of flame erupted from the muzzle. Down below, Rat screamed, not in pain, but in shock, as his pistol was ripped from his hand, spinning away into the undergrowth. He stared at his hand, which was now a bloody, mangled mess, his trigger finger gone. Silence descended, broken only by the choking gasps of the dying horse and Rat's pathetic whimpering. Elias and Clara emerged from the trees, moving with calm, deadly purpose. Elias walked over to Jebediah's body and, without a word, put another bullet in his chest for good measure. Clara kept her rifle trained on Rat, who had collapsed against a tree, cradling his ruined hand. "Please," he sobbed, tears and snot running down his face. "Don't kill me. I'll give you anything." Elias walked over to the struggling horse. The animal's eyes were wild with terror, its legs kicking spasmodically. With a look of something akin to pity, Elias drew his heavy knife and sliced the horse's throat. The animal gave one last, shuddering gasp and went still, its blood steaming in the cool air. He then cut the rope, and the massive carcass crashed to the ground. He turned his cold eyes on Rat. "You're right," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're going to give us everything." They dragged him off the trail, deep into the woods. They tied him to a tree, pulling the rope so tight he grunted in pain. Elias took out the branding iron they had brought, a simple iron rod with a crow's talon forged onto the end. He placed it in the small fire he had built. Clara stood back, watching. She had expected to feel a surge of triumph seeing this man, this creature who had held her down, now helpless and terrified. Instead, she felt a cold, empty detachment. This was not about passion. This was a procedure. An execution. "Who are you people?" Rat blubbered, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the iron begin to glow in the flames. Elias crouched in front of him. "We're the people you left for dead," he said softly. The look of dawning horror on Rat's face was terrible to see. He started to babble, to plead, to offer money, horses, anything. Elias led him. Then he asked his first question. "How many men are at the main camp?" Rat hesitated for a second, and Elias simply gestured with his head towards the glowing brand. 30. "Maybe 32, Rat shrieked. "Give or take. Who's in charge when Blackvein is away?" "Silas. His brother. A mean bastard, but stupid. All muscle." One by one, Elias dismantled the gang's secrets. Rat, in his terror, gave them everything. The camp layout, the guard rotations, the location of their powder stash, the secret route Blackvein used to visit a brothel in the mining town of Dusty Gulch, the name of the sheriff on his payroll. He was a fountain of information, desperate to trade secrets for his life. Clara listened to it all, her mind a cold, calculating machine. She saw the plan forming, the next steps, the path to Blackvein's door. The fear she had once felt had been cauterized, replaced by the hard and yielding steel of her purpose. When Elias was satisfied, he stood up. Rat looked at him, a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I told you everything," he whimpered. "You'll let me go now, right?" Elias looked at Clara. It was her decision. Clara stepped forward. She looked down at the man who had participated in her violation, who had laughed at her pain. She saw no remorse in his eyes, only fear for himself. He was not a man. He was a parasite. She pulled the pistol from her belt, the one they had taken from the dead sentry. She cocked the hammer. The sound was a loud, definitive click in the quiet woods. "Do you remember me?" she asked, her voice quiet. Rhett stared at her, his mind finally connecting the dots. The woman he had helped torture, the one they had left in the snow. His face went slack with utter, soul-shattering terror. "You?" he gasped. "Yes," she said. "Me." She didn't waste another word. She raised the pistol and shot him in the chest. The bullet slammed him back against the tree, and his eyes glazed over. Elias pulled the branding iron from the fire. It glowed a malevolent orange. He pressed it against the forehead of the dead man. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a sickeningly sweet odor that made Clara's stomach churn. But she didn't look away. She watched as their enemy's own symbol was seared into his skin. A message. They left him tied to the tree, a grotesque scarecrow for his comrades to find. They took the horses and rode hard, putting distance between themselves and the scene of their work. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The deed was done. They had information, and they had sent their first real message. That night, they made a cold camp miles away. As Clara tried to sleep, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The crack of the trap, the scream of the horse, the look in Rat's eyes as he died. She felt the ghost of a tremor in her hand and clenched it into a fist. Elias, who she thought was asleep, spoke from the darkness. "It's done, Clara. Don't let it live in your head." "It's not the killing," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "It was the look on his face when he knew who I was. It was satisfying. And that scares me, Elias." He was silent for a long moment. "This is a hard road we're walking," he said finally. "It changes you. The trick is to not let it turn you into the thing you're hunting. Remember why we're doing this. Not for pleasure, not for bloodlust, for justice. Hold on to that. It's the only anchor you'll have in this storm." She lay back, staring up at the sliver of moon visible through the canopy. An anchor in the storm. She clung to the thought. Justice. It was a simple word, but it had to be enough. Meanwhile, back on the trail, a pair of riders from the Crow's Fan gang, sent to find out what was keeping Jebediah and Rat, found the scene. They saw the dead horse first, then the body of Jebediah, already attracting flies. And then, one of them saw him, a figure tied to a tree, just off the trail. He approached cautiously, his hand on his gun. He saw the bullet hole, the slack-jawed expression. But it was the mark on the forehead that made his blood run cold. The Crow's talon. Their own brand. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting into the dark, silent woods around him. The forest that had always been their hunting ground suddenly felt alien, menacing. It was watching them. He and his partner turned their horses and galloped back towards the main camp, their faces pale with a new, unfamiliar emotion. Fear. The seed had been planted. The mining town of Dusty Gulch was a festering sore on the face of the Montana Territory. It was less a town and more a collection of tents, ramshackle saloons, and mud-choked streets, all clinging to the side of a hill that was being systematically disemboweled in the search for gold. It was a place where hope came to die and desperation was the only currency that mattered. According to the late outlaw known as Rat, it was also Blackveins' sanctuary. "This is a fool's errand," Elias grumbled as they watched the town from a wooded ridge. He was out of his element, a mountain man forced into a cage of civilization, however crude. The noise, the smell, the sheer number of people grated on his senses. "We should be in the mountains, picking them off, not walking into the viper's nest." "Rat said Blackvein comes here," Clara insisted, her voice firm. She had traded her buckskins for a simple, drab dress she had stitched together from a merchant's bolt of cloth they'd liberated from their first victims. With her hair tied back and a shawl covering the brand on her shoulder, she looked like any other weary woman trying to scratch out a living in this harsh land. "He said the sheriff, a man named Barlow, is on his payroll. If we want to dismantle the gang, we need to cut off its head. But to do that, we need to understand its reach. The sheriff's office is where we'll find it." Her logic was sound, but it didn't make Elias any less uneasy. Their war had, until now, been fought on their terms, in the wilderness they controlled. This was the enemy's territory. All right, he conceded, but we do this my way. Quietly. We are ghosts, remember. We go in after dark. We find what we need, and we are gone before the sun rises. No shooting, no fighting. We are smoke. Their target was the sheriff's office, a squat log building with a flimsy-looking jailhouse attached to the back. Red Hat provided a crucial piece of information. Sheriff Barlow was a creature of habit. Every night, he would close his office, walk 2 doors down to the Gilded Cage Saloon, and drink himself into a stupor until the early hours of the morning. His office, and whatever secrets it held, would be empty. They waited until the moon was high and the sounds of drunken revelry from the Gilded Cage were at their peak. Dressed in dark clothes, they slipped into the town, keeping to the shadows of the alleys. The main street was a river of mud and chaos, with drunken miners stumbling between saloons and painted ladies beckoning from shadowy doorways. It was easy to go unnoticed. The sheriff's office was dark, as expected. The lock on the back door was a joke, and Elias had it open in seconds with a thin piece of metal he'd filed down for the purpose. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them, and were plunged into a darkness that smelled of stale whiskey, cheap cigars, and unwashed bodies. Elias lit a small, shielded lantern, casting a pool of flickering light. The office was small and cluttered, a desk overflowing with papers, a gun rack on the wall, and a large iron safe in the corner. "He's a lawman," Elias whispered, running his hand over the safe. "But he's a lazy one. He won't keep his real secrets in there. Too obvious. Look for a ledger, a logbook, something he wouldn't want his deputies to see." They began a methodical search. Clara, with her quick, nimble fingers, went through the desk drawers. They were filled with wanted posters and paid bills and legal forms. Nothing. Elias checked the shelves, tapping the walls, searching for a hidden compartment. It was Clara who found it. Tucked away on a high shelf, hidden behind a stack of dusty territorial statutes, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It looked innocuous, official, but when she opened it, she knew she'd struck gold. The first few pages were legitimate entries, fines collected, arrests made, official town business. But then the handwriting changed, becoming more of a scrawl. The entries were no longer official. They were coded. Names were listed next to figures and dates. Shipments of goods, payments for silence, and, recurring again and again, the initials BV. "Elias," she breathed, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look at this." He came over, holding the lantern high. He scanned the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," he confirmed. "This is everything. Look here." He pointed to an entry. BV. $500 freight acquisition. That was the day your father's wagon train was hit. And here sheriff's cut $100. This bastard Barlow wasn't just turning a blind eye. He was getting a piece of the action. The ledger was a testament to the gang's operations. It detailed their network of informants, the merchants who fenced their stolen goods, the routes they used, the bribes they paid. It was the gang's entire nervous system, laid bare on cheap paper. "This is more powerful than a dozen rifles," Elias said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "This can bring the whole rotten structure down." Suddenly, they heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden boardwalk outside. Heavy and steady footsteps, accompanied by drunken singing. "Barlow," Elias hissed, immediately dousing the lantern. "He's early." They were trapped. The back door was their only exit, but they would be seen. The front door led right onto the main street. They had seconds. Elias's eyes darted around the small room and landed on the jail cells at the back. "In here," he whispered, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her towards the cells. He swung the iron-barred door open. It groaned in protest. They slipped inside one of the filthy cells just as the key turned in the front lock. Elias pulled the cell door shut, but didn't latch it, just as the main door to the office creaked open. Sheriff Barlow stumbled in, a large, corpulent man with a florid face and a whiskey-soaked mustache. He was mumbling to himself, fumbling to light a lamp on his desk. From the darkness of the cell, Clara and Elias watched, their hearts pounding. They were 10 feet away, hidden only by the shadows. Barlow lit the lamp, flooding the office with a warm, yellow light. He flopped down in his chair with a heavy sigh and pulled a bottle from his desk drawer. He took a long, gurgling swallow. He seemed ready to settle in for the night. This was a disaster. They couldn't stay here until morning. Then, Barlow's eyes fell upon the high shelf. Clara felt a jolt of ice in her veins. The ledger. In their haste, she hadn't put it back exactly as she had found it. A corner of it was protruding slightly from behind the law books. Barlow stared at it for a long moment, his drunken brain slowly processing the discrepancy. He squinted, then pushed his chair back and stood up, swaying slightly. He reached up to the shelf. Clara held her breath. Elias's body was coiled like a spring beside her, ready to explode into violence. Their quiet mission was about to turn into a bloodbath. Barlow pulled the ledger down. He stared at the cover, a confused look on his face. He opened it, flipping through the pages. As he reached the coded entries, his face began to change. The drunken flush drained away, replaced by a pasty, white fear. He knew someone had been there, had seen his secrets. He spun around, his hand instinctively going for the pistol on his hip. His wild, terrified eyes scanned the dark corners of his office. He took a step towards the back, towards the jail cells. "Who's there?" he bellowed, his voice a mixture of drunken bravado and sheer panic. "Show yourself." He took another step. The lamplight cast his shadow long and menacing against the cell bars. He was so close Clara could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. Elias knew they had no choice. But he wasn't going to start a gunfight. He had a better idea. As Barlow raised his pistol, peering into the darkness of the cells, Elias let out a low, guttural growl from the depths of his throat. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a cornered bear, a predator in the dark. At the same time, from the adjacent cell, Clara whispered a single, chilling word, a sound that carried on there like a death rattle. Vain. The effect on Barlow was catastrophic. Already drunk and terrified, his mind, steeped in guilt and paranoia, snapped. The combination of the bestial growl from one direction and the ghostly whisper of his master's name from another was too much. He thought the devil himself was in his jail. He screamed, a high-pitched and manly shriek of pure terror. He didn't fire his gun into the cells. He didn't stand his ground. He turned and fled. He scrambled out the front door, leaving it wide open, and ran screaming into the main street of Dusty Gulch, the incriminating ledger still clutched in his hand. "He's seen me," he shrieked at the bewildered miners and prostitutes who stared at him from the saloon doorways. "He knows. Blackvein knows. He's come for me." In his panic, he tripped and fell headlong into the muddy street. The ledger flew from his grasp, its pages fluttering open in the muck. A few curious onlookers began to drift towards it. From the office, Elias and Clara watched the scene unfold. "It seems our ghost just made a public appearance," Elias murmured, a rare hint of dark humor in his voice. They didn't wait to see the fallout. They slipped out the back door and melted back into the alleys, their mission, in a strange, unexpected way, accomplished. They hadn't needed to steal the ledger. The terrified, guilt-ridden sheriff had delivered it to the public himself. As they rode out of town, they could hear the shouting increase as people gathered around the mud-soaked book. The secrets of Sheriff Barlow and the Crow's Fang gang were now the property of Dusty Gulch. "Blackvein will hear of this," Clara said, as they reached the safety of the hills. "I'm counting on it," Elias replied. "We didn't just expose his tame lawmen. We used his own name to do it. We made him look weak in his own sanctuary. He'll be angry, and angry men make mistakes." They had struck a blow not with bullets or knives, but with information and fear. They had turned the enemy's own corruption against them and sown chaos in their ranks without firing a single shot. The war for the mountains had just entered a new, deadlier phase. The news from Dusty Gulch traveled on the wind, spreading through the mountains like a contagion. Tales of a shrieking sheriff, a ledger full of secrets laid bare in the mud, and a ghostly whisper of vain in the darkness grew with each telling. For the isolated pockets of miners and trappers, it was a source of nervous gossip. For the Crow's Fan gang, it was a declaration of war. Blackvein received the news from a breathless, terrified rider 2 days later. He was in his main camp, a fortified collection of rough-hewn cabins and tents hidden in a high, box canyon. He was a man of medium height, with a weary strength that was deceptive. His most striking feature was his mismatched eyes. One was a piercing, intelligent blue, the other a dead, milky white. It was this dead eye that seemed to see more, to judge more harshly. He listened to the writer's stammering report without a word, his expression unreadable. When the man finished, Vane calmly walked over to the fire, picked up a burning piece of wood, and pressed it against the writer's cheek. The man screamed, but Vane held him fast, the smell of searing flesh filling the air. "You bring me rumors and panic," Vane said, his voice a soft, sibilant whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You will learn to bring me facts. And you will learn not to show fear. Fear is a disease. Is that understood?" He pulled the brand away, leaving a weeping, angry burn. "Yes, Vane," the man gasped, trembling. Vane turned to his brother, Silas, a mountain of a man with a brutal, simple face. "Barlow is a loose end. Go to Dusty Gulch. Silence him. Burn the town to the ground. Let them know the price for whispering my name." Silas grinned, a cruel, ugly expression. "With pleasure, brother. And find out who did this," Vane added, his blue eye narrowing. "This wasn't a rival gang. This was precise. Someone is hunting us. Someone who knows us. Find them. Bring them to me. I want to look them in the eye before I take them apart, piece by piece." High in their mountain sanctuary, Elias and Clara were unaware of the specifics, but they knew the hornet's nest had been kicked. "Vane will retaliate," Elias stated, cleaning his rifle by the firelight. "He can't let the challenge in Dusty Gulch go unanswered. He'll make an example of them." "Good," Clara said, her voice cold. "Let the world see the monster for what he is. But his anger isn't just for the town. It's for us. He knows he's being hunted now." "Let him," Elias grunted. "The more men he sends out looking for us, the more we can pick off. He's a snake, and we just rattled his cage. Now he has to come out of his hole." Their new strategy was born from the information gleaned from Rat and the chaos they had sown. Vane had a weakness, his pride. He ruled his gang through a carefully crafted aura of fear and invincibility. By exposing his puppet sheriff and using his own name to create panic, they had tarnished that aura. Now, they had to press that advantage. "Rat said Vane has a powder stash," Clara recalled, "for blasting rock and other things. He said it's kept in a small cave behind the main camp, lightly guarded." A slow, wolfish grin spread across Elias's face. "A snake's nest full of gunpowder," he mused. "Now that is an interesting thought." The plan they devised was audacious and incredibly dangerous. While Vane's attention was focused on Dusty Gulch, and his men were scouring the mountains for their phantom enemies, Elias and Clara would sneak into the heart of his territory and destroy his ammunition supply. It would be a crippling blow, leaving the gang without the means to wage their war of terror. The journey to the Box Canyon was the most perilous they had yet undertaken. They moved only at night, sleeping during the day in hidden crevices and dense thickets. They were deep in enemy territory now, and every shadow could hold a sentry. Every bird call could be a signal. Clara felt a constant, low hum of adrenaline. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was different now. It was a whetstone, sharpening her senses, keeping her alert. She moved with a confidence that surprised even herself, her eyes and ears attuned to the subtle rhythms of the wilderness. She was no longer a visitor here, she was a predator. They reached the ridge overlooking the Crow's Fang camp on the third night. The sight of it sent a jolt through Clara. Down below, nestled in the canyon, were 2 dozen structures, lit by the flickering orange of a massive central bonfire. Men moved about, their laughter and crude shouts echoing up the canyon walls. It was the place from her nightmares, made real. For a moment, she felt the old, helpless terror wash over her. Elias put a hand on her arm. "Don't look at the camp," he said, his voice a low anchor in the storm of her emotions. "Look at the objective." He pointed to a spot on the canyon wall, behind the main cluster of buildings. "The cave. That's all that matters. The rest is just noise." She took a deep breath, forcing the images from her mind. He was right. The camp was the past. The cave was the future, a future where these men were powerless. They waited until the deepest point of the night, what Elias called the sleepy hour, when the sentries were tired and the cold had driven most of the men into their cabins. They began their descent, using the narrow, treacherous goat path that Elias had spotted with his spyglass. It was a near vertical drop, with loose shale that threatened to give way with every step. They reached the canyon floor and melted into the deep shadows at the base of the cliff. They moved with painstaking slowness, a shadow flowing from one patch of darkness to another. The cave was just as Red had described it, its entrance partially obscured by a canvas tarp. 2 guards sat by a small fire a few yards away, sharing a bottle. They were listless, bored. "I'll take the one on the left," Elias whispered, his breath warm against Clara's ear. "You take the one on the right. Use the knife." No noise. None. Clara nodded, her heart hammering. This was different from the lookout post. They were inside the beast's lair. They moved in perfect unison, to silent wraiths detaching from the darkness. Elias was a blur of motion, his large hand covering his target's mouth while his blade slid home. The man died without a sound. Clara's target was turning his head to take the bottle from his companion as she struck. She wasn't as strong as Elias, so she used speed and precision, just as he had taught her. She drove her knife into the soft spot behind his ear, severing the spinal cord. His body went limp, the bottle falling from his hand and landing softly in the dirt. They dragged the bodies into the shadows and turned their attention to the cave. Behind the tarp, stacked in neat, terrifying rows, were dozens of barrels and crates. Gunpowder, dynamite, blasting caps, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. It was enough to supply a small army. Elias worked quickly, his hands sure and steady. He pulled out several sticks of dynamite and a long fuse. "This will be enough to bring the whole cave down on top of itself," he whispered. "When this goes, it will be a funeral pyre." He set the charge, then looked at Clara. "We have about 5 minutes once I light this. We go back the way we came, and we don't stop running until we're a mile away. Ready?" She nodded, her eyes wide in the gloom. He lit the fuse. It sputtered to life, a small, incandescent snake eating its way towards oblivion. They slipped out of the cave and began their retreat, moving as quickly as they dared through the shadows. They reached the base of the goat path and began to climb. They were halfway up when a shout echoed from the camp below. "Hey, Jed? Marco, you awake over there?" One of the gang members, on his way to relieve the guards, had found the post empty. Lights began to flare up across the camp. More shouts. The snake was waking up. "Go," Elias hissed, pushing Clara ahead of him. Faster. They scrambled up the path, loose rocks skittering down behind them. Below, the camp was erupting into a chaotic swarm of activity. Men were running out of cabins, rifles in hand, yelling questions. Someone discovered the bodies. A wave of panicked shouts went up. They were almost at the top of the ridge when the world turned white. The explosion was not just a sound, it was a physical force, a concussion that slammed into them, stealing the air from their lungs and nearly throwing them from the cliff face. A massive fireball erupted from the mouth of the cave, lighting up the entire canyon like a second sun. A heartbeat later, the sound hit them, a deafening, cataclysmic roar that shook the very mountains. The cave collapsed, a river of rock and earth pouring down, burying the arsenal forever. Secondary explosions from the ammunition crates went off like a string of firecrackers, sending shrapnel and debris whizzing through the air. From the top of the ridge, Elias and Clara looked down at the scene of utter devastation. The gang's camp was in chaos. The force of the blast had flattened the nearest cabins. Men were screaming, running in every direction, their panic amplified by the darkness and the roaring fire. As they watched, a different glow began to appear on the southern horizon. A faint, angry orange against the night sky. "Dusty Gulch," Clara breathed. Elias nodded grimly. "Vane is sending his message. And we have just sent ours." They had crippled the Crow's Fang gang, taking away their teeth and clothes. And miles away, Vane's own act of brutality was showing the world exactly who he was. They were two fires burning in the night, one of destruction, one of retribution. And in the middle, caught between the flames, were the men of the Crow's Fang gang, who were quickly learning that their mountain hunting ground had just become a trap. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. The twin fires in the night, the apocalyptic explosion at the Crow's Fang camp, and the punitive burning of Dusty Gulch sent shockwaves through the territory. The gang, now deprived of its main supply of gunpowder and ammunition, was wounded, its aura of invincibility shattered. Black Vane, returning to a scene of chaos and ruin, was incensed. He had been struck, hard, in his own sanctuary while his back was turned. The attack was not just an act of sabotage, it was an act of profound disrespect, and in Vane's world, Disrespect was a sin punishable only by the slowest and most agonizing of deaths. His rage, however, was cold and focused. He gathered his remaining men, his one good eye scanning their fearful faces. They were spooked, looking over their shoulders, seeing ghosts in every shadow. The rumors of a single, phantom killer had now been replaced by the terrifying reality of a foe who could walk into their camp, kill their guards, and turn their own arsenal against them. "They want us to be afraid," Vane whispered, his voice cutting through the nervous murmurs. "They want us to scatter, to run. We will do the opposite. We will tighten our grip. We will hunt them down. From this moment on, every man who is not a friend is an enemy. Every stranger is a suspect. We will squeeze these mountains until this ghost has nowhere left to hide." His paranoia became his strategy. He dispatched his men in larger groups, ordering them to patrol the trade routes and question anyone they came across with brutal efficiency. The gang's terror, once focused on enriching themselves, was now the desperate lashing out of a wounded beast. Travelers were dragged from their wagons, trappers were tortured for information, and isolated homesteads were burned on the mere suspicion of harboring Vane's phantom enemy. The mountains, once a place of dangerous freedom, became a landscape of fear. For Elias and Clara, the world had shrunk. Their movements became more cautious, their hiding places more remote. The mountains were no longer empty, they were filled with Vane's eyes and ears. "He's using a net to catch a fish," Elias observed as they watched a patrol of 10 men ride through a valley below them. "It's clumsy, but a big enough net will eventually catch something. So we can't keep picking them off on patrols," Clara concluded. "The odds are too great now." "No," Elias agreed. "We have to change the game again. We have his ledger. We have the names of the men who help him, the merchants and officials who profit from his crimes. We've been fighting the muscle. It's time to attack the skeleton." Their new targets were the gang's facilitators, the respectable men in the surrounding towns who allowed Vane's operation to flourish. Their first target was a merchant named Phineas Croft, a man whose name appeared frequently in Barlow's ledger. Croft ran the largest trading post in the town of Three Forks, and according to the ledger, he was the primary fence for the gang's stolen goods. "Croft won't be a fighter," Elias planned. "He's a man of numbers and quiet deals. We can use that. We won't need bullets for this. We'll need his own greed." They spent a week observing Three Forks and Croft's routine. He was a man of meticulous habits, opening his post at sunrise, closing it at sunset, and spending his evenings in his office, poring over his account books. He lived in a small apartment above the store. Their plan was simple, relying on the psychological terror they had become so adept at creating. One night, while Croft was at his supper club, Elias, with his skill at bypassing locks, slipped into the merchant's office. He didn't steal anything. He didn't damage anything. He simply left a message. On Croft's pristine, organized desk, he placed a single, scorched playing card ace of spade sand on top of it, a single bullet. Then he vanished. The next night, he did it again. This time, he left a hangman's noose, beautifully and terrifyingly tied, coiled neatly on Croft's pillow. The effect on Phineas Croft was profound. He was a man who lived in a world of predictable profits and losses. This was an unknown, terrifying variable. He hired guards, barred his windows, but the ghost still got in. One morning, he awoke to find the words "we know" written in soot on his bedroom mirror. He began to unravel. His hands trembled when dealing with customers. He started drinking heavily. He saw accusation in every friendly face. His carefully ordered world was crumbling. Claire's role was to be the catalyst. She entered his trading post one afternoon, dressed as a simple homesteader's wife. She browsed for a while, then approached the counter where the haggard-looking Croft was tallying his accounts. "Pardon me," she said, her voice quiet and steady. "I was told you might be able to help me. I'm looking to transport some delicate goods, and I heard you're a man who knows how to make arrangements." Croft looked up, his eyes wide with panic. The innocent words, coming at the height of his terror, sounded like a death sentence. He thought she was one of them, that this was a test. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Clara leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, I think you do. A friend of Sheriff Barlow recommended you. Said you were very discreet." The mention of Barlow's name was the final straw. Croft let out a small, choked gasp. He looked past Clara, towards the door, as if expecting Black Vein himself to walk in. "Get out," he hissed, his voice trembling. "Get out of my store." His panicked outburst drew the attention of the other customers. A real sheriff's deputy, who happened to be buying tobacco, strolled over. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Croft?" the deputy asked. Croft, trapped between his secret partnership with Vane and his terror of the ghost haunting him, made a fatal decision. He chose the law he could see over the phantom he could not. "Her!" he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Clara. "She's one of them. She's with Vane. She was trying to blackmail me." The deputy, confused but obligated, turned to Clara. But Clara was no longer a simple homesteader's wife. Her demeanor had changed. She stood tall, and her eyes burned with a righteous fury. "He's the criminal," she said, her voice ringing through the silent store. "This man, Phineas Croft, is a partner to the Crow's Fang gang. He fences their stolen goods. He profits from the blood of men they've murdered." "Lies," Croft screamed. "She's a witch, a liar." "Then ask him," Clara challenged the deputy, her gaze unwavering. "Ask him to open his ledgers, the real ones he keeps in the safe in his office. Ask him to explain the payments to BV. Ask him why a simple merchant needs to launder money for murderers." The deputy, now intrigued and suspicious, looked at Croft. The merchant's face had gone the color of ash. He knew he was caught. In his terror, he made his second and last mistake. He lunged for a shotgun he kept behind the counter. He never had a chance to raise it. The deputy, a young but competent man, drew his Colt and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Phineas Croft collapsed behind his counter, his web of secrets and lies dying with him. Clara didn't wait for the aftermath. In the ensuing chaos, she slipped out the back door of the trading post and disappeared. The story of Phineas Croft's death and his final, panicked accusations spread like wildfire. The deputy, taking Clara's words seriously, had broken into the merchant's safe and found the incriminating ledgers. The evidence was undeniable. One of the pillars of Black Vein's shadow empire had crumbled, not from a direct assault, but from the weight of its own corruption, expertly nudged by a whisper and a ghost. For Elias and Clara, it was a victory, but a sobering one. They had used the law as a weapon, turning the system against itself. They had destroyed a man without laying a hand on him. "This is a different kind of war," Clara said that night, as they made a cold camp miles from the town. "It feels colder." "It is," Elias affirmed, staring into the darkness. "It's easier to understand a man you kill in a fair fight. What we did to Croft. We climbed inside his head and set his own fears on fire. It is effective, but it costs something." He was right. With every life they took, with every mind they broke, they were chipping away at the people they had been. Their quest for justice was exacting a price on their own souls. The line between the hunter and the hunted, between the righteous and the damned, was becoming thinner, harder to see in the gathering dusk of their war. And Black Vein, now robbed of a key ally and more furious than ever, was beginning to realize he wasn't fighting a simple band of rivals. He was fighting an idea. And an idea was much, much harder to kill. Black Vein was a man being slowly strangled. His operations were in tatters. His men were terrified, deserting in the night. His allies in the towns were either dead, like Croft, or had gone to ground, refusing to deal with him, fearing the ghost that haunted his enterprise. He was losing control, the one thing he valued above all else. The phantom enemy that struck from the shadows had done more damage with whispers and fear than a dozen rival gangs had ever done with bullets. Desperate, Vane did what all cornered animals do. He sought a stronger predator for protection. He sent a rider under a flag of truce to the one man in the territory even he was wary of, Colonel Atticus Thorne, a disgraced former army officer who now ran a brutal and highly disciplined mercenary company from a fortified ranch known as the Citadel. Thorne and his men were the final word. In violence in that part of the country cold, efficient, and loyal only to the highest bidder. Thorne agreed to a meeting. He received Vane not as an equal, but as a petitioner. The colonel was a tall, ramrod straight man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed silver mustache and eyes as cold and gray as a tombstone. He listened to Vane's story of phantom assassins and psychological warfare, his face betraying no emotion. "You have a ghost problem, Mr. Vane," Thorne said when Vane had finished, steepling his fingers. And you want me to be your exterminator? I want them found, Vane snarled. I want them brought to me. I will pay any price. The price will be steep, Thorn said coolly. Half of your remaining territory and a quarter of all future profits. My men will operate under my command, not yours. They will answer to me, and me alone. In exchange, I will hunt down this ghost of yours and deliver it to you. Do we have an accord? Vane's good eye twitched. The price was extortionate. It was surrendering a huge piece of his empire. But he had no choice. He was bleeding out, and Thorn was the only surgeon who could stop it. Accord, Vane bit out, the word tasting like ash. News of the alliance spread quickly. The arrival of Thorn's mercenaries changed the landscape completely. They were not like Vane's disorganized thugs. They were soldiers. They moved in disciplined patrols, set up professional pickets, and began a systematic sweep of the mountains. They didn't rely on terror and intimidation. They relied on maps, tracking, and relentless, methodical pressure. For Elias and Clara, the danger level had increased tenfold. These are not saloon bullies, Elias said grimly, watching a patrol of Thorn's men through his spyglass. They moved with a lethal economy he recognized from his own past. These are professionals. They know what they're doing. Our old tricks won't work. The net Vane had cast was now being drawn tight by expert hands. Their hunting ground had shrunk to almost nothing. They were being flushed out. We can't fight them head-on, Clara stated, her mind racing. And we can't hide from them forever. They'll find this cabin eventually. Then we have to end this, Elias said, his voice low and final. We have to go for Vane himself. One clean cut to sever the head of the snake. But with Thorn's men protecting him, getting to him will be difficult. The opportunity, when it came, was from an unexpected source. A lone trapper, one of the few men Elias trusted from his years on the mountain, sought him out. The man was old and weathered, and his eyes were full of fear. Thorn's men, they're clearing everyone out, the trapper said. They offered me coin to report any sign of you. They told me what to look for. A big man travels with a woman. He spat on the ground. I ain't no man's dog. But I heard something you need to know. Vane is moving. He's pulling his core men out of the main camp and relocating to an old, abandoned mine up on Widow's Peak. Thorn convinced him his main camp is too exposed. The mine is a fortress. One way in, one way out. This was it. The final move of the game. Vane was retreating to his castle. If he gets in there, we'll never get him out, Elias said after the trapper had gone. Then we have to stop him before he does, Clara replied. We have to hit him on the road. It was a suicide mission. They would be attacking Vane's personal retinue, which would undoubtedly be protected by Thorn's best men. It would be 2 against. How many? 20? 30? The odds were impossible. Elias looked at Clara. He saw the grim determination in her eyes, the utter lack of fear. She had come so far from the broken girl in the snow. She was a warrior now, his equal in every way. But he felt a pang of responsibility, of a promise he had made to himself to keep her safe. There's another way, he said slowly, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. You could leave. Take the trapper's route north. You could be in Canada in a week. Start a new life. This is my fight now. My oath. Clara stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. Your fight, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Did you wear the brand? Did you listen to them laugh? Did you lie dying in the snow? This fight was mine long before it was yours. We started this together, Elias. We will finish it together. Or we will die together. The conviction in her voice was absolute. There was no more argument to be made. In that moment, he knew his internal struggle was finally over. His oath not to kill had been a shield to protect himself from his own past. Clara had shown him that some things were more important than self-preservation. Justice. Retribution. Standing for someone who could not stand for themselves. His path was clear. It led straight to Widow's Peak. All right, he said, a note of finality in his tone. Together. He went to the heavy chest beneath his floorboards, the one where he kept the relics of his mercenary past. He had shown Clara the thunderpots, but he had not shown her what else was inside. He pulled out 2 items, wrapped in oilcloth. The first was a Colt Dragon revolver, a massive, heavy pistol of incredible power and accuracy. The second was a lawmen revolver, a strange and deadly weapon with two barrels and for its 9-round cylinder of .42 caliber ammunition, and a second, lower barrel designed to fire a single shotgun shell. It was a weapon for close, brutal fighting. A killer's gun. "I haven't touched these in 15 years, he said, his voice a low rumble as he began to clean and oil them. "I swore I never would again." He looked up at Clara, and his eyes were filled with a cold, hard light she had never seen before. "Blackvein and Colonel Thorne want a war. It's time they met the man I used to be." Their plan was desperate, relying on surprise, chaos, and the unique, deadly terrain of the Montana mountains. They would not meet Vane's column on the open road. They would intercept them in a place known as the Devil's Jawbone, a narrow, winding pass flanked by steep, wooded slip as a perfect kill box. They would use the last of their resources, the thunderpots, to create confusion, the traps they were so skilled at building to funnel the enemy, and a final, terrible surprise Elias had been saving. "Vane is moving his men to a new location," Elias explained as he sharpened a wicked-looking hatchet. "They'll be carrying supplies, ammunition, everything they have left. They'll be slow. They'll be confident, because Thorne's men will be with them. That confidence is what we will use to kill them." As they prepared for the final battle, a quiet understanding passed between them. They were no longer just allies in vengeance. The shared hardships, the violence, the quiet moments by the firelight had forged something deeper between them. A bond of profound and spoken loyalty. They were two solitary souls who had found their only other half in the crucible of a bloody revenge quest. "Clara," Elias said, pausing his work. "Whatever happens up there," he struggled with the words, a man unaccustomed to speaking from the heart. "I know," she said, cutting him off, her voice soft. She reached out and placed her hand on his scarred, calloused one. "Me too." There was nothing more to say. They finished their preparations in silence, two ghosts preparing to meet their destiny. They were heading into the heart of the storm, to face down a private army and a sociopath. The odds were they would not be coming back. But they would not die alone, and they would drag Blackvein and his whole rotten world to hell with them. The Devil's Jawbone was aptly named. It was a geological scar, a narrow canyon carved by an ancient river, with sheer rock faces on one side and a steep, heavily wooded slope on the other. The trail at the bottom was barely wide enough for a wagon. It was a natural trap, and Elias knew every inch of it. This was where their war would end. For 2 days, they had worked like fiends, turning the pass into a meticulously crafted killing field. They rigged a deadfall at the narrowest point, a massive old-growth pine, its base mostly sawn through, held in place by a single, thick rope tied to a trigger mechanism downslope. When tripped, the tree would fall, completely blocking the canyon and splitting the enemy column in two. On the wooded slope above the trail, they prepared their main assault. They chose a position that gave them a clear field of fire, and they stockpiled their weapons, the Hawken rifle, Elias's heavy Sharps buffalo gun, the pistols, and a dozen of the Thunderpod grenades. Their final preparation was the most brutal. Using the last of the stolen dynamite, Elias set a charge deep within the rock face on the other side of the canyon, directly across from their position. He ran a long fuse back across the canyon floor, burying it under dirt and leaves, leading it all the way up to their nest. "When I light this," he explained to Clara, his face grim, "it will bring half the cliff face down. Anyone on the trail below will be buried under 100 tons of rock." It was a weapon of mass destruction, indiscriminate and terrible. It was a tool he had learned to use in a war he had tried to forget, and its use now signified that he had fully shed the skin of the peaceful mountain man and re-embraced the cold calculus of the mercenary. The vow he had made to himself was not just broken, it was being ground into dust. They finished their work and settled into wait, concealed in a dense cluster of rocks and brush. The silence of the forest was a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break. "I used to think the silence was peace," Elias said quietly, his eyes scanning the empty trail below. "But it's not. It's just an absence of noise. Peace is something you have inside. I haven't had it in a long, long time." "After this, Elias," Clara said, her voice a soft promise. "When this is done, maybe we can find some." He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. The woman he had rescued was gone, replaced by this formidable warrior. He had armed her, trained her, but her strength, her will, it was all her own. He felt a surge of fierce, protective pride. Maybe, he said. And in that single word, she heard the hope he rarely allowed himself to express. On the morning of the third day, they came. The column was led by a vanguard of 10 of Thorne's mercenaries, moving with disciplined precision. Behind them came Blackvein and his remaining 20 men, a disorganized, surly mob surrounding a single supply wagon. Bringing up the rear was Colonel Thorne himself, flanked by 10 more of his elite soldiers. They were confident, almost arrogant, moving through the mountains as if they owned them. Elias and Clara watched them enter the canyon, their hearts pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat. They let the vanguard pass the deadfall trigger, then waited for the supply wagon and Vane's personal retinue to reach the center of the kill zone. Now, Elias breathed. Clara, positioned 20 yards away with her Hawken, had a clear line of sight to the trigger rope. She had practiced the shot a dozen times. She took a steadying breath, aimed not at the rope but at the small knot holding it fast, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the rope snapped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that sounded like a dying giant, the massive pine tree began to lean. It picked up speed, crashing down into the canyon with the force of a thunderclap, shaking the very ground. It landed perfectly, its huge trunk completely blocking the path, trapping Vane and his men between the vanguard and Thorne's rearguard. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then, all hell broke loose. "Grenades!" Elias roared. They began to hurl the thunderpots down onto the trapped men. The iron spheres exploded with deafening bangs and brilliant flashes of white light, filling the narrow canyon with thick, choking smoke. Men screamed in confusion and pain, their horses rearing and panicking. The disciplined mercenaries were momentarily blinded, their formations breaking as they tried to make sense of the chaos. Through the smoke, Elias began to fire the Sharp's rifle, its massive .50 caliber slugs punching through the chaos with brutal effect. Each shot was a deafening boom, each one finding its mark. Beside him, Clara fired the Hawken, reloaded, and fired again, her movements a fluid, practiced dance of death. They were not aiming for Thorne's men, they were systematically eliminating Vane's thugs, the men she remembered from the camp, picking them off as they stumbled blindly through the smoke. Down below, Colonel Thorne was a rock of calm in the maelstrom. Up the slope, he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. "Find them! Pincer movement! Go!" His men, professionals to the last, reacted instantly. The rear guard began to scramble up the wooded slope, trying to flank Elias and Clara's position. The vanguard, cut off by the fallen tree, turned and began to do the same on their side. "They're coming!" Clara yelled, firing at a mercenary who was climbing towards them. "Let them," Elias growled. He had finished picking off Vane's men, and now turned his attention to the supply wagon. Vane and a few of his core men, including his brother Silas, were using it for cover. Elias tossed aside the Sharps and grabbed the Lemet revolver. He turned to Clara. "Keep them off me. I'm ending this." He broke cover, charging down the steep slope towards the wagon, a terrifying figure, a mountain of a man roaring a battle cry that was pure, primal rage. He moved with a speed that belied his size, leaping over rocks and deadfalls. Clara laid down a covering fire, her Hawken barking, forcing Thorne's advancing men to take cover. She saw Silas, Vane's brutish brother, rise from behind the wagon and level a shotgun at the charging Elias. "Elias!" she screamed. She didn't have time for a full reload. She poured powder straight down the barrel, dropped the ball in, and fired without seating it properly. The rifle kicked like a mule, and the shot was wild, but it served its purpose. The ball whizzed past Silas's head, making him flinch and duck back behind the wagon. That second was all Elias needed. He reached the trail, landing like an avalanche. He fired the Lamott's shotgun barrel, the blast of buckshot tearing a massive hole in the side of the wagon and sending two of Vane's men screaming to the ground. He then opened up with the revolver's main cylinder, each shot a deliberate execution. From behind the burning wagon, Black Vane watched in disbelief as this single berserker of a man dismantled the last of his gang. Panic seized him. He turned to run, to escape up the canyon, but a figure blocked his path. It was Clara. She had abandoned her perch, scrambling down the slope after Elias, her knife in one hand, the dead sentry's pistol in the other. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice calm. Vane stared at her. In the smoke-filled canyon, with her face set like stone, he didn't recognize her at first. He raised his pistol. "Get out of my way, girl," he snarled. "You don't remember me, do you?" Clara said, taking a step closer. "The merchant's daughter. The one who didn't scream. The one you left for dead in the snow." Recognition, and then sheer, abject terror, dawned on Vane's face. This was his ghost. Not a rival, not an assassin, but his own sin, come back to claim him. His moment of hesitation cost him. Clara fired her pistol, the bullet catching him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out in pain and dropped his gun. At that moment, Elias, having finished the last of Vane's men, stepped out from the smoke, his face a mask of blood and fury. He was a nightmare made real. Vane looked from the vengeful woman in front of him to the demonic giant behind him. He was trapped. Elias walked slowly towards him, a grim smile on his face. "You like to hear them scream, Vane. You like to see them beg." He drew his heavy skinning knife. "Let's see if they'll laugh without teeth." It was then that Colonel Thorne and his remaining men crested the slope. They saw the scene below. Their employer, wounded and disarmed, cornered by the two people who had single-handedly destroyed a gang of 30 men. "Drop your weapons," Thorne commanded, his men leveling their rifles. Elias didn't even look up. He kept walking towards the terrified Vane. Clara turned to face them. She stood between Thorne's men and Elias, her empty pistol in one hand, her knife in the other. Alone, defiant woman against a dozen trained killers. "This is not your fight," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "Our business is with him. Let us finish it, and you can have what's left of this territory. No one else needs to die today." Thorne considered it. He had been paid to protect Vane, but Vane was now a liability. His gang was gone. His reputation was ruined. The contract was, for all intents and purposes, null and void. And Thorne was a practical man. He had already lost half his men. He looked at the wild man about to butcher his former employer, and at the fierce woman who stood defiant before him, and he made a business decision. "Stand down," he ordered his men. He watched, his face an impassive mask, as Elias reached Vane. He watched as Clara turned back to witness the final act. Black Vane, the terror of the mountains, finally found his voice. He began to plead, to beg, to offer money. But his words were cut short by a choked gurgle. The battle of the Devil's Jawbone was over. The silence that descended upon the Devil's Jawbone was profound, broken only by the crackle of the burning wagon and the groans of the dying. Colonel Thorne and his remaining mercenaries watched from the slope as Elias Cutter stood over the body of Black Vane. The deed was done. Justice, in its most brutal and primal form, had been served. Clara walked over to Elias, her steps slow and heavy. She looked at the man who had been the architect of her torment, now just a bloody ruin in the dirt. She felt no triumph, no elation, only a vast, hollow emptiness. The fire of vengeance that had fueled her for months had burned itself out, leaving behind only ashes. Elias looked at her, his eyes, for the first time, showing the deep, soul-crushing weariness he felt. The berserker rage was gone, leaving behind the quiet, broken men who had sought refuge in the mountains all those years ago. His hands, covered in blood, trembled slightly. His oath, his penance, his where it was all over. Colonel Thorne, ever the pragmatist, made his decision. "Our contract was with Vane," he called down, his voice echoing in the quiet canyon. "Our business here is concluded. The mountains are yours." He didn't wait for a reply. He gave a crisp command, and his men turned and marched away, leaving the carnage behind without a backward glance. They were soldiers, and the battle was over. The politics of the aftermath did not concern them. Clara and Elias were alone. Alone with the dead and the silence. They didn't speak. There were no words for what lay between them, for what they had done and what they had become. With a shared and spoken understanding, they turned their backs on the dead and began the long walk back to the cabin. They walked through the mountains that had been their battlefield, but the landscape felt different now. The trees were no longer hiding places, they were just trees. The shadows were no longer menacing, they were just shadows. The war was over, and the world was slowly returning to its natural state. But they were not. They reached the cabin as the first flurries of a new winter began to fall. The small, sturdy structure that had been their sanctuary and their war room looked quiet, peaceful, a home. Inside, Elias built a fire. They took off their blood-stained clothes and washed themselves in silence, the water from the creek icy cold, a stark, cleansing shock. They tended to each other's wounds, cuts, bruises, the myriad small injuries of battle. His large, rough hands were gentle as he cleaned a gash on her arm. Her touch was steady as she stitched a cut on his brow. These simple, caring acts were more intimate than any words could have been. They sat before the fire, wrapped in blankets, and watched the snow fall outside, thick, white curtain drawing itself across the world, burying the blood and the bodies, promising a clean slate. "Is it over?" Clara whispered, her voice husky. Elias stared into the flames, the firelight dancing in his tired eyes. "The killing is over," he said. "I don't know if it will ever be over for us." He was right. They had survived. They had won. But the cost had been immense. The ghosts of the men they had killed, the echo of the cruelty they had witnessed and enacted, those would walk with them forever. They had set out to hunt monsters, and in the process, had been forced to embrace the monster within themselves. Clara looked at the brand on her shoulder, the crow's talon that had started it all. It no longer burned with shame or anger. It was a part of her now, a scar on her body and her soul, a permanent reminder of the price of survival. Elias rose and walked to the small window. He watched the snow piling up, burying the world he had fought so hard to cleanse. He had broken his most sacred vow. He had waded back into the river of blood he had tried so hard to escape. But this time, he had not done it for money or for a cause he didn't believe in. He had done it for her, for justice. And in that, perhaps, there was a strange, terrible kind of redemption. He turned from the window and looked at Clara. In the warm firelight, she looked almost like the girl she might have been, were it not for the hardness in her eyes, the scars on her skin. He saw his own brokenness reflected in her. That night, one of the Outlaws' cabins, which they had left standing, caught fire. Perhaps a stray ember from the wagon, perhaps a deliberate act by one of Thorne's departing men. It burned brightly against the falling snow, a final, defiant funeral pyre for the Crow's Fan gang. Clara and Elias stood outside their cabin, watching the distant blaze. The orange flames licked at the dark sky, a stark contrast to the pure, white snow. Clara reached out and took Elias's hand. Her grip was firm, her hand calloused like his own. He did not speak, but he looked down at her, and his eyes, for so long stormy and hard, held a flicker of something new. It was not peace. It was not happiness. It was acceptance. A quiet acknowledgement of the path they had walked together, and the uncertain one that lay ahead. He gave her hand a slight squeeze, a silent confirmation. They had survived. They had won. They were irrevocably changed, to scarred souls bound together by violence and loss. They were not the people they had been, but standing there, in the cold, silent wilderness, under a sky full of falling snow and distant fire, they were, at last, no longer alone.